Yazoo County, Mississippi, 2006. In the humid, quiet marshlands of the Delta, where secrets are as thick as the summer air, a young nursing student on a mission of love vanished into the night. The system, quick to judge and slow to act, filed her away as another restless soul who couldn't handle country life. But they underestimated her. For over a year, her captor believed he was in absolute control, the master of a small, dark world he had built just for her. He thought he had erased her, but he never knew that inside the silence, inside the darkness, a brilliant mind was at work, turning his perfect prison into the proving ground for an escape no one thought possible. Before I begin, thank you for watching. I'd love to know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is there. It means a lot to know you're here, sharing these stories with me. We're in this together. Now let me tell you the story. Brooklyn Weber, at 24, was a woman living between two worlds. The first was the fast-paced, intellectually demanding world of nursing school in Jackson, a place of bright lights, late-night study sessions, and the promise of a future she was building for herself. The second, and the one that held her heart, was the slow, quiet, and deeply rooted world of her grandmother's small, neat home in rural Yazoo County. She had moved back a year ago, putting her own ambitions on hold to become a caregiver for the woman who had raised her, a decision that was as natural to her as breathing. Her life was a carefully balanced routine. Her studies, her night shifts at the local assisted living center, and the quiet, loving rhythms of caring for her grandmother. On a warm evening in the summer of 2006, that balance was about to be irrevocably shattered. Her shift at the center had been long and demanding, and a deep, bone-weary exhaustion had settled over her. As she walked out into the humid, cricket-filled darkness of the parking lot, she was thinking only of the soft, cool sheets of her bed. She slid into the driver's seat of her old, slightly rusted but deeply reliable Toyota, turned the key, and was met with a series of pathetic, sputtering clicks, followed by a profound and final silence. The battery was dead. A wave of pure, unadulterated frustration washed over her. It was after 11 p.m., and she was miles from home. As she sat there, a familiar figure emerged from the shadows of the building. It was Dale Marin, a local handyman in his early 40s. Dale was a known quantity in the small town, a quiet, unassuming man who had done odd jobs for the assisted living center and for dozens of other businesses and families in the area. For years, he was the man you called when you had a leaky faucet or a broken fence post, a part of the town's background scenery, as unremarkable as the old oak tree in the town square. "Car trouble?" he asked, his voice a low, gravelly drawl. He peered at her engine with an air of practiced expertise. "Looks like your alternator's shot. You're not going anywhere in this tonight." His offer of a ride was a normal neighborly gesture in a place where people still looked out for one another. Brooke, though cautious by nature, felt a sense of relief. He was a familiar face. Harmless. "I'll even give you a hand with the car in the morning," he offered, his kindness seeming to be a simple, uncomplicated fact. It was this small-town trust, this belief in the inherent goodness of a familiar face, that was her one, and ultimately catastrophic, vulnerability. She locked her car, thanked him, and climbed into the passenger seat of his old, beat-up pickup truck, a single, fateful decision that would be the last free choice she would make for a very long time. The ride began in a comfortable, if slightly awkward, silence. The cab of Dale's truck was cluttered and smelled of oil, sawdust, and stale coffee, the familiar, unremarkable scent of a working man's vehicle. For the first few miles, everything felt normal. He took the main highway, the route that led directly toward her grandmother's house. But then, in a move that was so subtle, so casual, that it took her a moment to even register it, he took a turn. It was a small, unpaved dirt road, a road that led not toward the town, but away from it, deep into the dark and largely uninhabited woods and marshlands that surrounded the county. "Shortcut," he said, his voice a flat, unemotional statement that was not an explanation, but a declaration. A small, cold prickle of unease, the first faint whisper of a primal alarm, began to sound in the back of Brooke's mind. "I don't think this is the right way," she said, her own voice a model of forced, polite calm, her nursing student's training in de-escalation kicking in. "It's the right way for me," he replied. And in that moment, the man beside her was no longer the harmless, familiar handyman. The quiet, unassuming mask had fallen away, and in its place was a stranger, a man whose eyes, in the dim green glow of the dashboard lights, were as cold, as flat, and as dead as a snake's. The quiet man was gone, and in his place was a predator. He drove for what felt like an eternity, the truck's tires churning up the mud of the winding, increasingly isolated dirt road. The woods closed in around them, a black, suffocating curtain of pine and cypress, their branches dripping with Spanish moss like the gray, skeletal fingers of old men. Finally, he pulled into a small, overgrown clearing. In the truck's headlights, a dilapidated, windowless, and deeply menacing structure materialized from the darkness. It was an old, abandoned hunting shed, a place of profound and absolute isolation. He led her inside. The air was thick with the smell of rust, of damp, rotting wood, and of a cold, earthy finality. And in the center of the single, dirt-floored room, illuminated by the harsh, bare bulb he switched on, was the true and horrifying purpose of their journey. It was not a table. It was not a bed. It was a large, rough-hewn, wooden shipping crate, roughly 7 feet long and 4 feet wide. It was old, but it had been recently and brutally reinforced. Thick, industrial-grade bolts secured the heavy, planked lid. Small, crudely drilled air holes, no bigger than a dime, dotted its surface. It was not a storage box. It was a cage. It was a tomb. The full, unimaginable, and soul-crushing reality of her situation descended upon Brooke in that moment. The helpful neighbor had brought her to the end of the world. In the days that followed Brooke's disappearance, her grandmother's world slowly, and then very quickly, began to unravel. The initial, low-grade worry of a granddaughter who was late coming home from work soon curdled into a frantic, all-consuming terror. The calls to the assisted living center confirmed that Brooke had left at the end of her shift. The calls to her friends confirmed that no one had seen or heard from her. Her car was still sitting, cold and silent, in the parking lot. Her first call to the sheriff's department was met with a calm, bureaucratic, and deeply infuriating indifference. The deputy who took the call was polite, but his tone was one of weary, seen-it-all condescension. He took down the information, but the lack of urgency was palpable. "Ma'am," he had said, his voice a folksy, placating drawl, "your granddaughter is a 24-year-old adult. Adults leave on their own all the time. She probably just went to a friend's house, and her phone died. She'll turn up in the morning." But she didn't turn up in the morning. She didn't turn up the next day. Brooke's grandmother, her face now a pale, drawn mask of pure, unadulterated terror, went down to the station in person. She sat in the sterile, unwelcoming lobby for over an hour before a detective finally agreed to see her. The detective listened to her story, his expression one of professional, detached sympathy. He took her statement, but his questions were laced with the same subtle and deeply insulting biases as the first deputy's. Was she having any trouble at home, ma'am? Any arguments? A new boyfriend, perhaps? The final and most damning dismissal came a week later. The detective called her and informed her that they were closing the active investigation. "We've spoken to some of her friends," he said, his voice full of a false, gentle finality. "They mentioned she had been talking about her nursing career in Jackson. And frankly, ma'am, she's a city girl. It's our professional opinion that she probably just couldn't handle country life and went back to the city for work without telling anyone." It was a neat, tidy, and completely fabricated narrative, a story that required no work, no investigation, and no allocation of the department's precious resources. The case was filed away, a single, thin manila folder in a vast, dusty archive of the forgotten, its official status a testament to a system that had, from the very beginning, chosen the easiest and most convenient lie. Amid the department's apathy, a single, quiet, and deeply consequential voice of dissent was beginning to form. Deputy Carla Jones was a young, ambitious, and often overlooked black woman in a rural, predominantly white, and deeply traditional sheriff's department. She was an outsider in her own uniform, a woman who had to be twice as good, twice as tough, and 10 times as observant as her male colleagues just to be taken seriously. She had learned to navigate a system that was often dismissive of her perspective, to keep her head down, to do her job with a quiet and steely professionalism. When the missing person report for Brooke Weber had first come across her desk, she had felt a familiar and deeply unsettling chill. It was not just the story of a missing young woman. It was the echo of other stories, of other, similar cases involving women of color that had been so quickly and so callously dismissed by her superiors. While the other deputies saw the case as just another adult who left on their own, Carla saw the first, faint, and deeply troubling outline of a pattern. Her suspicion was not just a hunch, it was based on a specific, and to her, a deeply significant piece of information. She remembered, from a few months prior, a minor and officially ignored harassment complaint that had been filed against a local handyman, Dale Marin. A young woman had reported that he had been showing up at her house, uninvited, offering to do work she hadn't asked for, his presence quiet, persistent, and deeply unnerving. The complaint had been dismissed as a misunderstanding, but Carla had remembered the name, and she knew that Marin had done work at the assisted living center where Brooke had last been seen. While the official case file on Brooke was being buried in the archives, Carla started her own, quiet, and deeply off-the-books investigation. In a small, spiral-bound notebook that she kept in her locker, a place where prying eyes would not find it, she started a new page. At the top, she wrote the name Brooke Weber, and below it, she wrote the name Dale Marin, and she underlined it twice. It was a small, secret, and deeply insubordinate act of defiance. It was a refusal to accept the official silence. She made a personal vow, a quiet promise to a woman she had never met, and to a grandmother whose grief she had seen and felt with a profound and deeply personal empathy. She would not let this case go cold. She would check in on Brooke's grandmother every month. She would keep digging, quietly, on her own time. She was a single, small, and seemingly powerless cog in a large, indifferent machine. But she was a cog that was, for the first time, beginning to turn in the opposite direction. Brooke's new world was a universe of darkness, of silence, and of a profound and soul-crushing isolation. Her life was now measured not in days or hours, but in the terrifying, unpredictable intervals between her captor's visits. The crate was her home, her prison, her entire, physical reality. It was a rough, wooden box, the air inside thick and stale, the darkness absolute, a heavy, suffocating blanket that pressed in on her from all sides. The only sensory input she had was the rough, splintered texture of the wood beneath her fingertips, the sound of her own ragged breathing, and the frantic, hammering beat of her own heart. Dale's visits were a study in cold, methodical, and absolute control. The first sound would be the groan of the shed's old, metal door. Then, the heavy, deliberate tread of his work boots on the dirt floor. He would not speak. He would simply unbolt the heavy lid of the crate, the sound of the metal bolts sliding from their housings a loud, jarring, and terrifying intrusion on the silence. The lid would be lifted, and the harsh, blinding light from the single, bare bulb overhead would flood the small space, a painful, searing shock to her unaccustomed eyes. He would place a plastic bottle of water and a small, pathetic offering of food, a piece of stale bread, a cold, half-eaten hot dog, the scraps from his own solitary meals on the floor of the crate. And then, without a word, he would replace the lid, and the world would be plunged back into absolute, terrifying darkness. The sound of the bolts sliding back into place, a final, deafening punctuation mark on her continued and seemingly endless imprisonment. But the most brutal part of her captivity was not the physical deprivation. It was the psychological torment. He was not just her jailer. He was the architect of her despair. He would speak to her, his voice a low, dispassionate monotone that was more terrifying than any shout, a voice that was designed to methodically and completely dismantle her hope. "No one is looking for you," he said one day, his voice a disembodied godlike presence from beyond the darkness of the crate. "I saw the sheriff. He was at the diner. He thinks you ran away. They've already stopped looking. They've forgotten all about you." Another time, he delivered an even more cruel and more personal blow. "Even your grandma stopped asking about you," he lied, his voice a river of smooth, plausible poison. "I saw her on her porch yesterday. She was laughing with a neighbor. She's moved on. She's forgotten all about you." Each lie was a carefully aimed and surgically precise blow, designed to chip away at her spirit, to sever her last, desperate connection to the world she had lost, to the love that had been the anchor of her entire life. He wanted to break her, to make her believe that this dark, silent, and utterly hopeless box was her entire world now, and that he was its only and all-powerful inhabitant. While Brooke's world had shrunk to the horrifying, claustrophobic dimensions of a wooden box, Dale Marin's world remained exactly as it had always been. Quiet, unassuming, and completely, and chillingly, normal. This was the key to his camouflage, the genius of his particular and deeply pathetic brand of evil. He understood, with a kind of predatory, intuitive cunning, that the best way to hide a monstrous secret was not in the shadows, but in the bright, unforgiving, and utterly mundane light of the everyday. His life was a routine, a predictable and deeply boring rhythm of work and solitude. He would leave his small, slightly neglected house at the same time every morning, his old, beat-up pickup truck, a familiar and completely unremarkable sight on the town's quiet streets. He would perform his handyman duties with a quiet, competent, and deeply forgettable efficiency. He was the man who would fix a neighbor's leaky roof, accepting their thanks with a short, non-committal nod, his eyes never quite meeting theirs. He would sit alone in a booth at the local diner, eating his lunch in a profound, and what the other patrons saw as a slightly sad, solitude. He was invisible in his normalcy. The narrator highlights the chilling and deeply infuriating irony of his public life. He was a ghost, a man who moved through the community without ever truly being a part of it. His silence was misinterpreted as shyness, his solitude as a kind of harmless, backwoods eccentricity. The community, a place where everyone knew everyone else's business, knew nothing about the real Dale Marin. They did not know about his criminal past, about the violent assault charge that had sent him to prison years ago, a fact he had successfully buried upon his return to the county. They did not know about the deep, simmering, and venomous rage he harbored against a world he felt had left him behind, a rage that was particularly and murderously directed at women whose confidence, whose intelligence, whose very existence he saw as a personal affront. He was a predator hiding in plain sight, his true nature concealed not by a clever disguise, but by the community's own lazy assumptions, by their willingness to accept the simple, easy story of the harmless, quiet man on the corner. They saw a familiar, if slightly odd, figure, and they saw nothing to fear. And all the while, just a few miles away, in the dark, silent heart of the woods, the monstrous and true secret of his life was locked away, a testament to the fact that the most terrifying evil is often the one that we see every single day and choose, for our own comfort, not to recognize. While the official investigation had died a quick, bureaucratic death, a single, quiet, and deeply persistent front in the war for Brooke Weber's memory remained open. It was a lonely, two-person alliance, a secret and deeply unequal battle being waged by an elderly, grieving woman and a young and deeply insubordinate sheriff's deputy. Brooke's grandmother, her initial, frantic terror now settled into a deep, abiding, and soul-crushing ache, refused to be silent. Aided by the quiet, off-the-books support of Deputy Carla Jones, she kept her granddaughter's memory alive in a town that was trying its best to forget. Together, they would put up the faded and now rain-streaked, missing flyers at the post office, at the local grocery store, at the gas station, their small, defiant act of remembrance, a constant, if largely ignored, reproach to the town's comfortable and complicit silence. Her quiet, unwavering, and deeply intuitive belief that her granddaughter, her Brooklyn, a girl who was the very picture of responsibility and love, would never have just left, was the only force that was keeping Brooke from being completely and permanently erased. The monthly meetings between Brooke's grandmother and Deputy Jones were a ritual of shared and deeply guarded hope. Carla would visit the small, neat house not as a police officer, but as a friend. Her patrol car parked a block away so as not to attract attention. She would sit at the kitchen table, a place that was still filled with the ghostly presence of a young woman's laughter, and she would listen. She would listen as Brooke's grandmother would share a new, small, and often heartbreaking memory of her granddaughter. And in turn, Carla would share the meager and deeply frustrating scraps of information from her own secret investigation. She had confirmed Dale Marin's employment at the assisted living center. She had confirmed his criminal record, a fact that her superiors had dismissed as irrelevant to the current case. She had even, on her own time, driven the lonely dirt road that led to his property, a place that had given her a deep and deeply unprofessional sense of cold primal dread. It was not much. It was a case built on a foundation of whispers, of intuition, of a single, ignored harassment complaint. But for Brooke's grandmother, it was everything. It was proof that she was not crazy, that her grief was not a delusion. It was a confirmation that one other person in the world, one person with a badge, believed her. Their small, secret alliance was a tiny, flickering candle in a vast and seemingly impenetrable darkness, a testament to the fact that even in a system that has chosen to forget, the stubborn and deeply human act of remembrance can be its own powerful form of resistance. Inside the suffocating, timeless darkness of the crate, a profound and remarkable transformation was beginning to take place. The initial, all-consuming and paralyzing terror that had been Brooke's constant companion for weeks and then months began to recede. It did not disappear, but it changed shape, crystallizing from a hot, chaotic, and emotional state into something else. A cold, hard, and incredibly focused state of clinical observation. The victim, her spirit bruised but not broken, was beginning to disappear, and in her place, a strategist was being born. Her nursing student's mind, a mind that had been trained to observe, to analyze, to diagnose, to find a logical path through the chaos of a medical emergency, took over. She stopped being a passive, terrified captive, and she became a scientist in her own dark and terrifying laboratory. She began to meticulously, and with a life or death focus, study the only variable in her universe, her captor. Dale Marin became her science project, her puzzle, the subject of a deep and profoundly dangerous psychological and behavioral study. She learned his rhythms, the predictable, mundane routine that was the scaffolding of his secret, monstrous life. She learned, from the sound of his heavy work boots on the dirt floor of the shed, the exact moment he arrived in the evenings. She learned to distinguish the sound of his truck's specific, sputtering engine from the sound of any other vehicle that might, on the rare occasion, use the distant, main dirt road. She studied his moods, which she soon realized were almost entirely, and predictably, dictated by the contents of the brown, glass bottle of whiskey he brought with him to the shed every night. She learned that the early evening Dale, the Dale that had just come from his day of performing normalcy in the town, was tense, angry, and prone to sudden, violent, and unprovoked outbursts. This, she learned, was the most dangerous time, a time to be as silent, as still, as an animal playing dead. But as the night wore on, as he drank more, as the level of the liquid in the bottle went down, he would change. His sharp and violent anger would dissolve into a thick, sippy, and deeply pathetic stupor. This was the most crucial and most hopeful discovery of all. His nightly ritual of drinking himself into oblivion was not just a habit, it was a weakness. It was a flaw in his otherwise absolute control. She would listen to the sounds from the shed, the murmur of the small, battery-powered radio he would sometimes play, the clink of the bottle against a glass, the increasingly loud, slurred, and self-pitying muttering he would engage in with himself. And then, the final, most important, and most beautiful sound of all, the heavy, rhythmic, and completely unconscious snoring that signaled he had passed out, usually in the old, broken-down armchair he kept in the corner. His drunkenness was her window of opportunity. It was the one time when the tyrant was just a sleeping, pathetic, and deeply vulnerable man. This knowledge became the cornerstone of her plan, the single, exploitable flaw in the architecture of her otherwise perfect prison. She was no longer just a frightened little girl. She was a strategist, a hunter, patiently, silently, and brilliantly, studying the monster in his lair, waiting for the perfect moment to exploit his one, great, and ultimately fatal, weakness. The discovery was an accident, a small, hopeful anomaly in a universe of grim, unchanging, and deliberate reality. It happened during one of Dale's rare and brutally efficient cleanings of the crate. Once every few weeks, he would remove her from the box for a few terrifying minutes, his presence a heavy, suffocating weight as she was allowed to use a small, chemical toilet he kept in the corner of the shed. While she was out, he would roughly remove the thin, filthy mattress, shake it out, and replace it. On this day, during the clumsy, violent act of him shoving the mattress back into the crate, something small and metallic had fallen from her own ragged clothing. It was the bent and broken nail from her old, silver bracelet, a piece of jewelry her grandmother had given her, a piece that had been broken in the initial struggle of her abduction. She had thought it was lost forever. In his haste, Dale hadn't noticed it. It had fallen onto the floor of the crate, a tiny, insignificant piece of her old life, now a secret part of her new one. Later, in the darkness, her searching fingers found it. It was not much, but it was something. It was a piece of metal. It was a tool, and it was a secret. Her mind, now a machine of strategic and desperate calculation, began to work. What could she do with it? What could she use it for? Her other, and more significant, discovery came a few nights later, a discovery born of a new and methodical exploration of her prison. In the dead of night, while Dale snored in the shed, she began a slow, painstaking, and completely silent tactile mapping of the crate. Her fingers, now as sensitive as a blind person's, traced every inch of the rough, splintered wood, searching for a flaw, a weakness, a mistake in his construction. And she found it. One of the large, industrial-grade bolts that secured the heavy lid, the one that was in the corner, just above her head, was slightly loose. It was a tiny, almost imperceptible flaw, a bolt that had, perhaps, not been fully tightened, an error born of his own, arrogant assumption of the crate's inherent and perfect security. She could feel it with her fingertips. It had a tiny, almost microscopic amount of give. It was a flaw, and she now had a tool, the bent and broken nail from her grandmother's bracelet, and the single, loose bolt. It was a pathetic, almost laughable set of resources with which to attempt an escape. But in her world, in the absolute and hopeless darkness of the crate, it was a blueprint. It was a plan. And for the first time in a very, very long time, it was a small, fragile, and incredibly, powerfully dangerous thing. Hope. The project was an act of pure, unadulterated, and almost unimaginable will. It began that very night. The routine was terrifyingly and necessarily precise. She would wait, her body coiled in the darkness of the crate, her ears attuned to the symphony of the night, listening for the one, single, and most important sound. She would wait for the snoring to begin, that deep, rattling, and deeply pathetic sound that was her signal, her starting gun, her permission to begin her secret, and deeply dangerous work. Only then would she move. She would crawl silently, her movements slow and deliberate, to the corner of the crate where the loose bolt was. Her heart would be a frantic, hammering drum in her chest, a sound that she was sure was loud enough to wake the dead, let alone the drunken, sleeping man just a few feet away. Every creak of the floorboards in the shed, every rustle of a mouse in the walls, would send a jolt of pure, ice-cold terror through her. With the bent nail from her bracelet clutched in her hand, a tool that was both a weapon of her liberation and a sacred relic of the life she had lost, she would begin her work. The process was agonizingly, maddeningly slow. The bolt was rusted into its housing, fused to the wood by a year of damp Mississippi air. The nail was a flimsy, inadequate tool, but it was all she had. She would fit the flattened and surprisingly sharp tip of the nail into the narrow space between the head of the bolt and the wood, and she would begin to turn, to pry, to scrape. The work was silent, a battle of attrition waged in the absolute and terrifying darkness. For the first few nights, nothing happened. The bolt wouldn't budge. The nail would slip, scraping her knuckles raw, the sharp, coppery taste of her own blood a familiar and deeply discouraging presence in her mouth. But she was persistent. She was patient. She was a nursing student, a woman who understood that the most profound changes often happen slowly, incrementally, on a cellular level. And finally, one night, after what felt like an eternity of fruitless and deeply painful labor, she felt it. A tiny, almost imperceptible give. A faint, gritty, and deeply, profoundly beautiful scraping sound as the bolt moved just a fraction of a millimeter in its housing. It was a victory so profound, so monumental, that it brought silent, hot tears to her eyes. It was proof. It could be done. For weeks, and then months, her nights were consumed by this secret, silent, and painstaking labor. She would work until her hands were raw and trembling, until her muscles ached with a fatigue that was deeper than any she had ever known. And every morning, before the first faint hint of dawn began to lighten the sky, before Dale would stir from his drunken sleep, she would meticulously, and with a spy's precision, cover her progress, ensuring that the bolt looked, to a casual and arrogant glance, exactly as it had before. She was a spy, a saboteur, a prisoner of war, silently, patiently, and brilliantly, digging her way, 1 millimeter at a time, to freedom. The passage of time, which had once been Brooke's greatest enemy, a slow, grinding, and soul-crushing force that was designed to erase her, now became her ally. A full year had passed since the night of her abduction, and in that year, a profound and ultimately fatal change had occurred in her captor. The initial, high adrenaline and paranoid caution of the early days of his crime had long since faded, replaced by a deep, abiding, and deeply arrogant complacency. Dale Merrin, in his own twisted and pathetic mind, had won. He had committed the perfect crime. He had taken a woman, a bright, confident, and full of life woman, and he had reduced her to a thing, a creature that he kept in a box. He had erased her from the world, and the world had not even seemed to notice. The initial, cursory police investigation had gone nowhere. The small, pathetic, and now rain-streaked flyers that her grandmother would occasionally put up were a source of amusement to him, a testament to his own superior cunning. He had gotten away with it. He believed that Brooke was broken, that her spirit, the very thing that had attracted his predatory, resentful gaze in the first place, was gone. She was silent. She was compliant. She was, in his eyes, just a part of the routine now, a thing he had to feed, a thing he had to maintain, like a piece of machinery or a caged animal. He no longer inspected the crate with the same meticulous, paranoid attention he had in the beginning. The bolts were secure. The lid was heavy. And the woman inside was, he believed, a hollowed-out shell, her will to live as extinguished as the light he so rarely allowed her to see. His belief that he was in absolute and permanent control had become his greatest and most profound vulnerability. His complacency was an act of pure narcissistic arrogance, and it was a mistake that would, in the end, cost him everything. He was a predator who had grown fat and lazy and who had made the fatal and classic mistake of all predators. He had underestimated his prey. He saw a broken, spiritless victim. He did not see the brilliant, patient, and deeply, murderously determined strategist who was, at that very moment, in the absolute and silent darkness of the crate, in the final and most delicate stages of her own masterful and deeply secret plan. The bolt was loose. After more than a year of painstaking, silent, and deeply painful labor, it was finally, and miraculously, free enough to be pushed out from its housing. Brooke had done it. Her escape was now, for the first time, not just a desperate, impossible hope, but a real, tangible, and terrifyingly close possibility. But now, a new, and even more difficult, phase of her plan began. It was a phase that required a different kind of strength, a different kind of courage. It was the phase of waiting. The bolt was loose, the door was unlocked, but she could not yet turn the handle. An escape on a quiet, clear, and moonlit night would be a suicidal act of folly. He was a light sleeper, his senses, even in his drunken stupor, attuned to the familiar, quiet sounds of his own, isolated world. He would hear the heavy, wooden lid of the crate scraping open. He would hear her footsteps on the dirt floor of the shed. He would be on her before she had even made it to the door. She needed a cover. She needed a distraction. She needed a force of nature that was loud enough, that was chaotic enough, that was powerful enough to mask the sounds of her own desperate bid for freedom. She needed a storm, and so she began to wait. She had a new and deeply urgent purpose. She became a student of the weather, a meteorologist of her own dark and sensory-deprived world. She used the only window she had, the small, dime-sized air holes in the lid of her crate. Through them, she could feel the subtle and often imperceptible shifts in the air outside. She could feel the rise in humidity that was a precursor to rain. She could feel the drop in barometric pressure that signaled an approaching storm front. Every evening, she would press her face to the air holes, her nose pointed toward the sky she could not see, and she would sniff the air, a small, feral, and deeply intelligent creature, testing the wind, waiting for the one specific scent of a coming and liberating storm. The wait was a new and particularly cruel form of torture. The key to her freedom was in her hand, but she could not yet use it. There were nights when her hope would soar, the air growing heavy and thick with the promise of rain, only to have it dissipate, the front moving in another direction, leaving her in a state of agonizing and deeply frustrating disappointment. But she was patient. She had learned, in her long, dark year of captivity, a patience that was as deep, as profound, and as unshakable as a mountain. She was a strategist, a general, waiting for the perfect and most advantageous conditions under which to launch her one and only attack. She was waiting for the heavens themselves to provide her with the cover, the chaos, and the beautiful, violent, and deeply welcome soundtrack for her own resurrection. The storm, when it arrived, was not a gentle rain. It was a violent, elemental, and almost biblical explosion, a classic Mississippi Delta thunderstorm that seemed intent on tearing the sky and the world apart. It began in the late afternoon, the sky turning a bruised and sickly yellow-green, the air growing still, heavy, and full of a deep and ominous electricity. And then the heavens opened. The rain came down not in drops, but in hard, driving, and almost solid sheets, hammering against the thin tin roof of the old, dilapidated shed with a sound that was like a continuous, deafening drum roll. The wind howled, a mournful, angry, and deeply terrifying sound that made the old, wooden structure groan and shudder on its foundations. And the thunder was a glorious, deafening, and almost continuous cannonade, each clap a violent, percussive blast that shook the very foundations of the shed, a sound so loud, so powerful, that it was a physical, vibrating presence in the air. It was perfect. Upstairs, or rather in the shed, Dale was in a state of panicked alcoholic terror. As Brooke had so brilliantly and so patiently observed, he had a deep, almost pathological fear of thunderstorms. The violent, uncontrollable power of nature was the one thing in the world that made him feel small, that reminded him of his own pathetic insignificance. He was drinking heavily, more heavily than usual, his fear a catalyst for his own self-destructive habits. And then, a new, and for him, a more immediate terror presented itself. The old, leaky roof of the shed, which he had never bothered to properly repair, finally gave way. A stream of muddy red water began to pour into the shed, the dirt floor quickly turning into a thick, ankle-deep quagmire. Dale, his mind a frantic, alcohol-fueled blur of panic, had one single thought: his truck. The dirt road that led to his property was a treacherous, muddy mess in the best of times. In a storm like this, it would be an impassable river of mud. If he didn't move his truck to higher ground, to the main gravel road, he would be trapped. His fear of being trapped on his own, isolated property was even greater than his fear of the storm itself. He made a fateful, and for Brooke, a miraculous decision. He stumbled out of the shed and into the raging storm. His one and only thought on the preservation of his one and only means of escape, leaving Brooke, for the first time in over a year, completely and utterly alone. This was her chance. The storm that was Dale's personal hell was Brooke's salvation. The moment she heard the shed door slam shut, the moment she heard the sputtering, panicked roar of his truck's engine as he fought to get it started, a calm, cold, and absolutely certain clarity washed over her. The time for waiting, for planning, for hoping was over. The time for action was now, but a new and deeply terrifying threat had presented itself. The floodwaters, which were pouring into the shed from the broken roof, were now seeping into her crate. The cold, muddy, and foul-smelling water was rising around her, a new and deeply claustrophobic horror. She was no longer just a prisoner. She was in danger of drowning in her own dark and silent tomb. With a strength born of pure, unadulterated, and desperate adrenaline, she went to work. She pushed her small, frail body against the single, loosened bolt. It resisted for a moment, its rusted metal threads still clinging to the wood. And then, with a final, desperate shove, it gave way, popping out from its housing and landing with a soft and deeply satisfying splash in the rising water. She shoved the heavy, waterlogged wooden lid. It was heavier than she had ever imagined, and for a terrifying, heart-stopping moment, it wouldn't budge. She pushed again, her muscles screaming, a raw, ragged, and triumphant sound tearing its way from her long-silenced throat. And the lid moved. She shoved it open just enough to create a gap, a small, dark, and beautiful sliver of freedom. She crawled out of the crate and into the cold, muddy, and ankle-deep water of the shed floor. The narrator describes her harrowing and deeply symbolic escape as a kind of brutal second birth. Barefoot, weak, her body emaciated from a year of malnutrition, her muscles atrophied from a year of confinement, she stumbled out of the shed and into the raging, beautiful, and deeply, profoundly welcome chaos of the storm. The rain, cold and hard, hit her face, washing away the grime, the tears, the scent of her own long captivity. She found the dirt path, and, guided only by a primal animalistic instinct, and by the distant, faint, and almost certainly imagined sound of highway traffic, she ran for her life. After what felt like an eternity, a lifetime, of running, of stumbling, of falling and picking herself up again, she collapsed. Her lungs were on fire, her legs were a weak, trembling, and useless mess beneath her. Her body, which had endured so much, had finally and completely given out. She had collapsed in a ditch on the side of a small paved road, her body half submerged in a muddy, rain-filled puddle. She was behind a small, all-night diner, its own, buzzing neon sign, a pale, blurry, and deeply ironic echo of the gas station sign from another story, another life. A truck driver, A man named Henderson, who was on his long, lonely, and overnight haul to Memphis, was pulling out of the diner's parking lot, his rig's powerful headlights cutting a sharp, bright swathe through the still driving rain. And in those headlights, he saw something. A pile of what he, at first, thought was just a pile of discarded muddy rags. But then the rags moved. He stopped his truck, his heart giving a sudden, sharp jolt of a mixture of fear and a deep and very human curiosity. He got out of his cab, the rain instantly soaking him, and approached the ditch. And then he saw her. He saw not a pile of rags, but a person, a young woman, or what was left of her, a frail, mud-caked and barely human figure, trembling uncontrollably in the cold, muddy water. He called 911, his voice a panicked, disbelieving shout over the sound of the storm. When the first, shocked and deeply unprepared, sheriff's deputies arrived on the scene, they found a scene from a nightmare. They found a woman who was more of a ghost than a person, a creature from another darker world. And as they gently, and with a dawning, horrified comprehension, lifted her from the ditch, as they wrapped her in a warm, dry blanket, as they looked into her wide, haunted, and deeply, profoundly intelligent eyes, they realized, with a shock that would send a tremor through their entire department, that they were looking at Brooke Weber, the young and long-forgotten nursing student, the runaway whose case had been gathering dust in their archives for over a year. She hadn't run away. She had been found. The story of Brooke Weber's escape, and of her year-long, horrifying ordeal, was a bombshell that exploded over the quiet, sleepy, and deeply complacent world of Yazoo County. The swift and deeply satisfying unraveling of Dale Marin's world was the final, public act of the drama. He was captured, without a struggle, at a truck stop 60 miles away, a pathetic and deeply ordinary-looking man who was trying, and failing, to outrun a truth that was now moving at the speed of light. On his property, investigators found not only the crude and deeply damning wooden crate, but a horrifying and heartbreaking archive of his other forgotten crimes. Buried in the dirt floor of the shed, they found a collection of women's jewelry, of driver's licenses, of scraps of clothing, the sad, final relics of other missing women, other runaways whose cases had been, like Brooke's, so easily and so callously dismissed. At his trial, Brooke, now strong, her voice clear and steady, her eyes full of a cold, hard, and deeply righteous anger, identified him. He was sentenced to multiple, consecutive life terms, a legal, if not a moral, accounting for the lives he had stolen and the one he had so nearly, but so miraculously, failed to. In the end, Brooke did not return to the quiet and now deeply haunted world of her grandmother's home. She moved to Atlanta, and she became a powerful, articulate, and deeply respected advocate for the missing, for the women, particularly the women of color, whose disappearances were, and still are, so often ignored by the systems that are supposed to protect them. The narrator closes on her powerful, and now famous, words from an interview, words that would become the title of her own best-selling book. "He built a box to keep me quiet," she said, her voice a testament to the indestructible power of the human spirit. "I built a voice to make sure no one else ends up in one." Deputy Carla Jones, now promoted to detective, her own, quiet, and deeply insubordinate, faith now publicly and professionally vindicated, stood beside her, a testament to the fact that even in a broken and deeply indifferent system, one person's refusal to forget can, in the end, make all the difference. Thank you for watching.